All right, so we've talked about the Renaissance, its development, how a new way of thought was being introduced, like from humanism to individualism, and the growing use of reason. Now, in the Renaissance, reason was predominantly applied to scientific endeavors. It was not necessarily applied to other things other than maybe religion. And this is what's going to differentiate the Renaissance from the Enlightenment, is that this reason would now start to move beyond the realm of science and into areas such as politics, sociology, just about any area of life. Now, where did this all begin? How did we get to the point of using reason to other things? And I think it was a natural process of what was happening. It was accumulation of the thought process of applying reason, of using the scientific method, taking that and then starting to apply it to such areas, for instance, like politics. And it was the application to areas like politics that made the use of reason in the Enlightenment so different, so unique, and something that we have not seen before. Now let's take a look at some of the basic characteristics of the Enlightenment. First, is the belief in the power of human reason. This is a carryover from the Renaissance, but it's an expansion of it. There's a renewed self-confidence in people and believing that the human being, the human mind can just about overcome anything. And one of the best phrases for the Enlightenment would be something made by Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T, K-A-N-T, and the expression he's used was dare to know. Dare to go out there and look at things, use your reason to explore options, find out new things, discover, change the way man's direction. These were all the characteristics. Daring to know, daring to find out things is an excellent description for this Enlightenment period. Reason, it was believed, for it to flourish, needed autonomy and freedom. Basically, it needed a way of just expressing itself without interference from others. And for this reason, a lot of the philosophers, that's all they did. These philosophers will often have sponsored. And so they can have this autonomy to think, so they can have the freedom just to think and to develop their reason. People would sponsor them, believe it or not, pay them just to think. And that's what they did. They made their living by just thinking through things, solving problems. And supporters or donors, often wealthy merchants or sometimes the aristocrats, would give them money to do this. Philosophers such as Bacon, Newton, Locke would all make their living out of just basically thinking and writing, and they would have sponsors to pay them due to this. Now, also you saw the increasing organization of knowledge. Things that were learned were now more organized. They were organized in books. They made certain schools of learning. The scientific method, help with the development and organization of different scientific classifications of animals and such forth. They started comparing and contrasting governments and classifying different types of government. And basically, another characteristic of the Enlightenment is it's basically cultural expansion. Basically, knowledge became more practical, was more applied to everyday life. It was spreading through basically free public information. Pamphlets were being spread, and writing for a larger audience. They were now not just writing for other philosophers. They were expanding to writing for just about anybody and that could read. And they had essay contests, expansion of literacy. So in the Enlightenment, you see this great expansion of culture, a great expansion of knowledge, more so than you ever did in the Renaissance. And it exploded across society. These philosophers are putting out pamphlets, they're putting out papers. Average people were wearing them, or were reading them. Kings were reading them, queens were reading them, businessmen were reading them. They were grasping a hold about all these ideas that were being just pumped out on a regular basis by these people, which is what they did. And this is they made ideas, and these ideas became flushed out to society. Society was becoming more and more literate, and this culture of the Enlightenment grew at an increasingly rapid rate. And what we see, and I sort of alluded to, is a new emergence of something that historians call a print culture. This is a culture that is surrounded, basically based on books, journals, newspaper articles, pamphlets, things that people could read. And it was a very, very lively world of publication. It spread knowledge rapidly. Most of the material was of secular concern. It really wasn't religious. It was the earthly, secular concerns. It concerned government, economics, practical things, even social issues. All these were covered. And more important, what made the print culture of the Enlightenment possible was the cheapness of the books and the cheapness of these materials. Anybody could afford to read now, and that was largely due to the printing press, the growth in printing things. And so it was the emergence of what we call the print culture that created an atmosphere that knowledge could be easily spread from place to place. And emerging from this print culture is something that has never really had an impact upon politics before, and this is called public opinion. Now the public could voice their thoughts, they could voice their opinions, and it had a huge impact on government. Predominantly, A, the people had a voice, but B, now if the government did something, people knew about it. They wrote books about it. They wrote pamphlets about it. They analyzed it. They applied reason to the government actions. And what we're seeing in the Enlightenment is the first emergence of public opinion and its impact upon the political environment, which was massive because it literally changed the political environment. Governments now had to worry and be concerned about what people thought about their actions. And that is a huge change from anything we have studied in any culture in the past. Now, the philosophers had to do a lot with shaping public opinion. It was them who created public opinion last time, a lot of time, and who gave the public ideas to think about. They didn't necessarily address issues of, say, classes, but a lot of what they wrote could provide intellectual ferment or intellectual momentum to people who wanted to make social changes. And so the philosophers were an extremely influential group of people, more so than you would ever think about it. Because if you think about them, the philosophers in and of themselves, they were a bunch of intellectuals, sort of like college professors. And that's what they did. But the ideas that they put out there help lead to something that would, reshape basically the concept of government in Western society. One of the concepts that basically helped reshape, society was this concept of natural rights, basically that rights that people were born with. And it was the philosophers who actually put these rights into practical use. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at now. And let's take a look at how they review these natural rights. They didn't mention them by name per se, but what they argued and what they said was based on the right of people to pursue their natural rights. And so let's take a look at, what each philosopher said, and this concept of, be thinking about the concept of natural rights, the rights you were born with. One of them mentioned influential was a guy named Voltaire. Voltaire was, a philosopher who basically was really unconstrained by anything. He really believed in religious freedom. He believed in the right of people to speak and express themselves in whatever manner they wish. Voltaire was an interesting guy who was truly an independent thinker. Now we get into Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. You're going to need to know their order and basically how these guys fit together. Hobbes believed that there was some kind of social contract between ruler and the ruled. The ruled, or the subjects, gave up certain rights so they could be protected by a strong ruler from each other. Hobbes had an extremely negative view of people, and he believed that a strong ruler was essential to keep people from acting selfishly, to keep people from basically running over each other. In contrast to this, Locke believed that, yeah, there is a social contract, but people are good, and that if the rulers violate this social contract, then the people themselves have the right to rebel. And Locke was a very, very influential scholar, especially when it came to those who formed the Declaration of Independence and during our own American Revolution. When you take a look at Hobbes versus Locke, they're like two polar opposites. Whereas Hobbes thinks people act selfishly, Locke thinks they're reasonable. Whereas Hobbes thinks without government, society would be chaotic. Locke thinks that freedom and liberty are more important. Whereas Hobbes sees people like children and they need a strong father. Locke thinks you can get rid of your dad or your ruler if they don't rule correctly. And even in that, let's look at where Locke thinks that the ruler's power comes from. He relates it directly to receiving his power from the consent of the government. Basically, from Locke's perspective, the ruler receives their power from those that he rules. Meaning that from Locke's perspective, so long as the ruler obeys his end of the contract, the people will allow him to rule. But the minute he breaks that contract, the minute he infringes upon their natural rights, the minute that he infringes upon their civil liberties from their freedoms, then he has broken that contract. And Locke would easily say that they can now overthrow that ruler and replace him with somebody else. And now we have Baron Montesquieu. And basically, he agreed with Locke that government should protect individual liberties, and that too much power could lead to something called tyranny or a dictatorship or the oppression of people's natural rights. But Montesquieu believed that the best way to protect rights and individual liberties and natural rights was through a check and balance system of government, whereas no one branch had more power than another. And nowhere is this more evident than in our own Constitution. He had a great influence upon that. And though his ideas were not necessarily new, because they were based partly on the Romans, but the way he presented them and in the manner he presenting them in a format where the people are in control versus a single solitary sole leader, was new. And it's to his credit that he is, taking the power away from a strong centralized monarch, which has been the characterized of most governments for thousands of years, moving that to the people who give consent, who give permission, the government permission to rule, and then instituting a system of government, a separated powers that protects the rights of these people so they cannot be abused. Now we have Rousseau. And Rousseau, like Locke before him, agreed that there was a social contract, and this social contract should have been based on the common good. But Rousseau believed that the best kind of democracy was a democracy that was based on the people's general will, which is a direct direct democracy, where the majority of the citizens control the direction of government. And when you take a look at the two, and you enter this comparison, and you take a look at this comparison between the two, you see that Montesquieu wants to take power from one king and basically put it in three branches of government that can limit each branch, limit the power of any one branch, whereas Rousseau wants to let the people make their own government and wants the majority to rule. And the majority basically gets what it wants. In essence, a direct democracy. Two separate types of government. One ruled by the people, one and has very little control, Rousseau. The other, Montesquieu, has a democracy, but one that prevents any one branch from gaining too much power. Interesting comparison. And if you look at the overall influence on our government, you can see elements of both of these philosophies in our government. You can definitely see the Barons de Montesquieu's view on it, but you can also see some of Rousseau's view where the majority does get to rule, but it's balanced with this check and balance system. And so it's interesting to note when you take a look at our modern day government, trace it back to these two philosophers, and you can definitely see the connections there. They are there, and you should be able to make those connections. Let's talk about this fellow, Cesar Beccaria, if I pronounced that right. He was focused on the criminal justice system. He was upset with the use of torture, corrupt trials. He basically said we should have fair and speedy trials, that trials should be open to the public, that both capital punishment and torture should be abolished. Basically, he's saying that the judicial system needs to go back to where it protects people's rights, in where people's rights are protected by a system of government, a system of legality that ensures that people aren't unfairly prosecuted, that people aren't being mistreated, and that their rights are being preserved, I should say. And he recognizes that the only way to do this is through a judiciary that is bound by rules that prevent this from happening. And finally, let's talk about the economic theory of capitalism that came from Adam Smith. Before his theory came along, people were really practicing something called mercantilism, which is basically a very gold-centered theory. You get the gold from your colonies, you keep it at home. Trade flow is restricted and regulated by government in mercantilism. But Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations basically wrote, hey, guys, let's get rid of the government control. Let the market determine prices. There should be free trade. There should be no government interference. Let the market, like natural laws, govern life. Let's take the rules of the natural world. Like in nature, there's no government interference. So why in an economy should it be in government interference? Using that reason, Adam Smith was. And so basically, he argued, remove mercantilism, remove restrictions of trade, and then let the market take force. Let the market determine how much something costs. Let the market determine the value of products, not the wealth. And he also very greatly argued for this removal of any kind of trade barriers so trade can flow freely among the nations. He believed in essence that wealth comes from labor as is applied to resources. Basically, you take the resources, you make them into something, you sell something. And he saw that as the basis of wealth, not gold. It was a process of turning natural resources into products and then selling them that generated your money. It wasn't a process of hoarding gold in your country. And his theories gradually caught on and would eventually influence our world today. And I thought this was a very interesting way to think about this in summary of everything, the impact of philosophy and the philosophers made on government. If you take a look, the old idea was a monarch's rule was justified by divine right. At the end of the Enlightenment, a monarch's rule, government's power now comes from the consent of the governed. Huge change. Now what you're looking at is basically I'm going to let you guys review this and make sure you know it front and back. It is basically the major ideas of the Enlightenment and their impact. You're going to have to know the impact. We touch on some in the main lecture. Also look on top. You can also see the contributions of various religions. And so make sure you know this. Make sure you have taken notes on this, because I may ask for them when I come back. And I hope y'all have a good day, and I will talk to y'all later. Thank you now. Bye-bye.